If someone had told me 6 months ago that my life would unravel because of a man standing on my porch drinking my beer, I'd have laughed them off. My wife, Claire, and I had built a life that looked perfect from the outside. A beautiful home nestled in the countryside, a thriving carpentry business I'd poured my soul into, and 10 years of marriage that I thought were built on unshakable trust. But life has a way of showing you that even the strongest foundations can crack. It started subtly, as these things often do. Claire seemed distracted, her attention drifting during conversations. At first, I thought it was just stress. She'd recently taken on a new project at work, organizing some charity gala, and she threw herself into it with the kind of enthusiasm I admired about her. But then there were the little things. Late nights became more frequent, her phone became glued to her hand, and she started dressing up more than usual, even for what she claimed were casual meetings. I told myself not to overthink it. Claire and I had been through rough patches before. We'd always come out stronger on the other side. I trusted her. Of course I did. But trust isn't blind, and soon, even I couldn't ignore the changes. There was one night in particular that stands out. She came home hours after she said she would, her excuse flimsy and her eyes avoiding mine. I asked her how the gala planning was going, trying to keep things light, but her answer was curt, almost defensive. "It's fine, Andrew. Just a lot of work," she said, brushing past me. She smelled of expensive cologne, one I didn't recognize. I wanted to confront her then and there, but something held me back. Maybe it was fear. Fear that asking the hard questions would open a door I couldn't close. So, I let it slide, convincing myself that I was imagining things. But the doubts didn't go away. They grew, fed by every missed dinner, every evasive answer, and every glance at her phone that ended with her turning the screen away. My neighbor, Derek, was the first person to plant the seed that maybe this wasn't all in my head. He caught me one evening while I was fixing the fence between our properties. "Hey, Andrew," he started, leaning on his rake. "Don't mean to pry, but I saw Claire in town the other day. She was with a guy. Didn't recognize him." I froze, my hands tightening around the hammer. "Probably someone from work," I said, forcing a smile. But Derek's expression told me he wasn't convinced. "Maybe," he replied, his tone cautious. "Just thought you should know." That conversation lingered in my mind for days. Derek wasn't the type to stir up trouble without reason. If he said he saw something, he saw it. But what was I supposed to do with that information? Accuse my wife based on a passing observation? I hated the idea of becoming the suspicious husband, the kind of man who second-guessed his partner at every turn. So, I buried it, pushed it down alongside all the other nagging doubts. But the cracks kept growing. Claire started spending weekends away, claiming she needed time to clear her head or catch up on work in peace. At first, I offered to join her, maybe turn it into a romantic getaway, but she always found a reason to say no. "I just need some space," she said once, her voice tinged with frustration. Space. That word hung in the air between us, heavier than it should have been. Then there was the beer. A small thing, really, but it hit me harder than I expected. I'd bought a six-pack of my favorite craft brew, a treat for myself after a particularly grueling week at work. I only managed to drink one before the rest disappeared. When I asked Claire about it, she shrugged. "I must have offered it to someone," she said vaguely, her eyes flickering away. "Someone? Who?" We hadn't had any visitors, or at least, none that I knew of. The final straw came on a quiet Saturday morning. Claire was out, shopping, she said, and I decided to clean up the garage. While moving boxes, I found an unfamiliar leather jacket stuffed behind the tool rack. It wasn't mine, and I hadn't seen Claire wear it before. My stomach churned as I held it, the faint scent of cologne clinging to the fabric. The same scent she'd come home wearing that night months ago. That was the moment I stopped pretending. Something was wrong. I didn't know who he was yet, but I knew there was someone else. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut, leaving me breathless and furious all at once. Still, I didn't confront Claire. Not yet. I needed answers, and I wasn't about to give her a chance to cover her tracks. For now, I played the part of the oblivious husband, watching, waiting, and preparing for whatever came next. Because one thing was certain, The man who thought he could take what was mine had no idea what kind of fight he was walking into. I thought the cracks in my marriage were the worst thing I'd have to deal with. Then Jack showed up. It was a quiet afternoon. Claire was out again, leaving me to tinker with the porch railing that had started to warp in the humidity. I remember the sound of tires crunching on the gravel driveway. I wasn't expecting anyone, so I looked up, wiping the sweat from my forehead with my sleeve. That's when I saw him. He stepped out of a shiny black car, wearing a suit that was just a little too crisp for a casual visit. Jack. I didn't know his name yet, but I didn't need to. The way he carried himself, the smug tilt of his head, the overly confident smirk. It was like he'd already decided he belonged here. I stayed where I was, gripping my hammer a little tighter as he strolled up the driveway. He moved slowly, deliberately, like he wanted me to notice every step he took. When he reached the porch, he stopped, glancing around as if he were appraising the place. His eyes lingered on the house I'd built with my own hands, then on me, as if I were just another piece of the furniture. "You must be Andrew," he said finally, his voice dripping with fake friendliness. He didn't extend his hand or offer an explanation for his presence. Instead, he looked past me, toward the door. "Nice place. Cozy." I stood up, every muscle in my body tense. "Can I help you?" I asked, keeping my tone as neutral as I could. He chuckled, low and condescending. "I think you know who I am," he said, his eyes narrowing slightly. Then, without waiting for an invitation, he reached down and grabbed one of my beers from the cooler sitting by the porch railing. My beer. I didn't move as he twisted the cap off and took a long, deliberate sip. He let out a satisfied sigh, leaning against the railing like he owned the place. "Claire's not here, huh?" he said casually, as if he'd been here a dozen times before. "That's a shame. I was hoping to see her." I could feel the blood pounding in my ears, but I forced myself to stay calm. "Who are you?" I asked, my voice steady but sharp. "And what do you want?" He laughed again, this time louder, as if the question itself was ridiculous. "Oh, Andrew," he said, shaking his head. "What I want? I've already got it. Your wife, your house, your life." He raised the beer in a mock toast. "This is my place now." I don't remember deciding to clench my fists. It just happened. Every word out of his mouth was like a match striking against a dry piece of wood, igniting the rage I'd been trying to keep buried. But I didn't let it show. Not yet. Letting him see me lose control would have been exactly what he wanted. Instead, I stared at him, letting the silence stretch. He took another sip of the beer, clearly enjoying his little performance. "Relax," he said finally, as if we were old friends. "I'm not here to cause trouble. Just thought I'd introduce myself properly. Claire's been telling me so much about you." It was then that I realized he wasn't just here for the thrill of confrontation. He was here to humiliate me, to assert some twisted form of dominance. And worst of all, Claire had given him the ammunition to do it. "I think you've overstayed your welcome," I said, my voice low and controlled. I took a step closer, not enough to be threatening, but enough to make it clear I wasn't backing down. Jack smirked, draining the rest of the beer before setting the empty bottle on the porch railing. All right, he said, raising his hands in mock surrender. "I'll go. For now. But let's not pretend this isn't happening, Andrew. Things change. People move on." With that, he turned and walked back to his car, pausing only to glance over his shoulder and flash that smug grin one last time. "See you around," he said, his tone almost a promise. I stood there, watching as his car disappeared down the driveway, my fists still clenched at my sides. The rage inside me was no longer just a spark. It was a fire, burning hotter with every second that passed. He thought this was over. He thought he'd won. But Jack didn't know me. He didn't know the lengths I'd go to protect what was mine. As I stared at the empty beer bottle on the railing, I made a decision. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. You don't realize how deep the betrayal runs until you start pulling at the threads. Jack's appearance on my porch wasn't just a wake-up call. It was a declaration of war. And if he thought I was going to roll over and let him take my life, my home, and everything I'd built, he was dead wrong. But before I could fight back, I needed to know exactly what I was up against. Claire came home late that night, as usual. I didn't ask where she'd been. I didn't need to. She walked past me in the kitchen, muttering a quick, "Hey," like I was some distant roommate. I stood there, watching her as she set her purse down and poured herself a glass of wine, acting like nothing had happened. Like she didn't know Jack had been here earlier, drinking my beer and spitting his arrogance all over my porch. I wanted to confront her. The words were right there, clawing at my throat, but I swallowed them down. Claire had already chosen her side, whether she wanted to admit it or not. Confronting her now would only tip her off that I was onto Jack. No, I needed to be smarter than that. Calculated. Patient. So, I started digging. The first step was simple. Figure out who Jack really was. He had the confidence of a man who had gotten away with this kind of thing before, and I was willing to bet he wasn't new to the game. I remembered Derek's warning about seeing Claire with another man in town and decided to start there. I called him the next day, casually asking if he'd seen that guy again. "Funny you should ask," Derek said, his tone laced with hesitation. "I saw him at the diner last week, sitting in one of the corner booths. Looked pretty cozy with Claire." That was all the confirmation I needed. I thanked Derek and hung up, my stomach churning. The pieces were starting to fit together, but I needed more. I couldn't just rely on rumors and suspicions. I needed hard evidence. That's when I hired Diane, a private investigator recommended by one of my business clients. Diane was sharp, no nonsense, and exactly what I needed. "I'll find out everything there is to know about him," she promised when we met. "And if he's got skeletons in his closet, I'll dig them up." It didn't take long for Diane to uncover the truth. Jack wasn't just some random guy Claire had met at a charity event. He was a professional con artist. His real name was Jonathan "Jack" Turner, and his modus operandi was disturbingly consistent. He'd target married women who felt neglected or unappreciated, charm them into trusting him, and then slowly dismantle their lives piece by piece. But Jack wasn't just after Claire. Diane discovered he had a pattern of infiltrating families to gain access to their assets, bank accounts, property deeds, even businesses. Jack would take it all before disappearing, leaving his victims to clean up the mess. He'd done it in 2 other towns before ours, leaving a trail of broken marriages and empty wallets. What shocked me most was how far he'd already gotten. Jack had been seeing Claire for months, meeting her at her work events, taking her on trips I believed were for her job, even using her connections to cozy up to people in our social circle. Some of my own acquaintances knew him by name, thinking he was just a charming new face in town. He'd woven himself into the fabric of our lives so seamlessly that no one had questioned it. The betrayal hit me like a freight train. Claire wasn't just complicit, she'd opened the door for him. Whether she realized it or not, she'd handed Jack the keys to our home, our finances, our future. And now he was standing on my porch, drinking my beer, and daring me to do something about it. Diane's report also revealed something even more sinister. Jack wasn't working alone. He had accomplices, a small network of people who helped him pull off his schemes. There was Mia, a tech-savvy hacker who gathered dirt on his targets, and Victor, a shady lawyer who covered his tracks. Together, they were a well-oiled machine, and I was their latest mark. That night, I sat alone in the dark, staring at the stack of evidence Diane had given me. Photos of Jack and Claire, bank statements showing suspicious withdrawals, records of Jack's previous scams. It was all there, laid out like a roadmap to my destruction. But here's the thing about roadmaps. They go both ways. Jack thought he was leading me into a trap, but he didn't realize I'd been studying the terrain. I wasn't just going to fight back. I was going to dismantle his entire operation, piece by piece. For the first time in weeks, I felt a sense of clarity. Jack might have been good at his game, but he'd made one fatal mistake. He underestimated me. And that, I decided, would be his undoing. The deeper I dug into Jack's life, the more I realized I couldn't do this alone. He wasn't just a man having an affair with my wife. He was a manipulative predator with a network of enablers. I was in over my head, and if I was going to bring him down, I needed allies. But finding people I could trust in a situation like this wasn't easy. Derek, my neighbor, was the first to step up. He'd been watching this whole thing unfold from the sidelines, and when I finally confided in him about Jack's identity, His reaction was immediate. "I knew something was off about that guy," he said, pacing my living room. "The way he carries himself, it's like he thinks he's untouchable." Derek wasn't just a concerned neighbor. He was resourceful. He had a knack for digging into things most people wouldn't think to question, and he offered to help me find more information about Jack's movements around town. "If he's been using Claire to get into certain circles, chances are he's left a trail," Derek said, his voice steady. "We just have to find it." While Derek kept an eye on Jack locally, I leaned heavily on Diane, the private investigator. She was relentless, uncovering more about Jack's accomplices with each passing day. First, there was Mia, the hacker who helped Jack gather dirt on his targets. Diane traced her to a string of online scams, most of which were buried deep in the digital underworld. Then there was Victor, the lawyer who covered for Jack's illegal activities. Victor wasn't just shady. He was practically untouchable thanks to his connections in the legal system. Diane also discovered another surprising connection. Jack wasn't just targeting Claire. He'd been cozying up to other women in town, planting seeds for future schemes. One of them was Linda, a widow who owned a chain of local businesses. Jack had been seen with her at several charity events, using his charm to worm his way into her trust. Diane suggested we approach her, but I hesitated. The last thing I wanted was to involve more innocent people in this mess. As I worked with Derek and Diane to piece together Jack's network, I started noticing how much influence he had already gained in our community. People spoke highly of him, calling him charismatic and driven. It made my blood boil, knowing how easily he could deceive everyone around him. But it also gave me an idea. If Jack thrived on his reputation, maybe that was where I could hit him hardest. Not everyone in town was blind to Jack's true nature, though. Diane introduced me to someone who had crossed paths with Jack before, a woman named Susan. She had been one of his previous targets, left nearly bankrupt after Jack drained her savings. Susan was bitter, but eager to help. "He ruined my life," she said during our first meeting. "If you're planning to take him down, count me in." Susan had valuable insights into Jack's methods. She explained how he would isolate his victims, creating wedges between them and their families or friends. "He makes you think he's the only one who truly understands you," she said. "By the time you realize what he's doing, it's too late." Hearing her story made me see Claire in a different light. I still couldn't forgive her, but I began to understand how she might have fallen for Jack's lies. He was a master manipulator, and she'd been his perfect target, lonely, frustrated, and longing for something she couldn't find with me. While I was building alliances, Jack was busy strengthening his grip on Claire. She became more distant, more defensive. When I tried to talk to her, she shut me down, accusing me of being controlling. "You're just jealous because someone else appreciates me," she snapped one night, her words cutting deeper than she probably intended. But I didn't take the bait. Arguing with Claire wasn't going to solve anything. If anything, it would only push her closer to Jack. Instead, I focused on the bigger picture, on dismantling Jack's network and exposing him for the fraud he was. The turning point came when Derek overheard Jack bragging about a new business venture at a local bar. He was talking about expanding his portfolio. "Whatever that means," Derek told me. "I think he's planning something big." That's when it hit me. Jack wasn't just trying to ruin my life. He was using Claire as a stepping stone to something larger, something that involved more people, more money, and more destruction. And if I didn't act soon, he was going to pull her, and maybe others, even deeper into his schemes. I looked around the room at my makeshift team, Derek, Diane, and even Susan, and felt a strange mix of anger and determination. Jack had underestimated me. He thought I'd crumble under the weight of his manipulation, that I'd let him waltz into my life and take everything without a fight. He was wrong. The more I uncovered about Jack, the clearer it became that this wasn't just about Claire. This wasn't even about me. Jack was playing a long game, and we were just pawns in it. He didn't simply want to take my wife and my home. He wanted to erase me entirely, to rewrite my life with him at the center, leaving nothing behind but ruins. Diane's investigation uncovered something that chilled me to the bone. Jack's endgame wasn't just to humiliate me. He had a plan to siphon my business assets, forge documents to claim my property, and leave me bankrupt. The pieces were falling into place. The time Claire spent away, the sudden interest Jack had shown in our community, the way he'd inserted himself into conversations with people I'd known for years. He wasn't just invading my personal life. He was taking over my professional one too. I learned that Jack had already started setting traps in my name. He'd been posing as my business partner to a few of my suppliers, offering to renegotiate contracts and pushing for deals that would tie up my resources. One supplier, a longtime associate named Carl, called me out of the blue. "Hey, Andrew," he said, his voice cautious. "I just wanted to confirm those changes you mentioned last week. Or, well, the guy you sent." "What guy?" I asked, my stomach tightening. "You know, Jack something? Said he was working with you to streamline things." I barely managed to keep my voice steady. "Carl, don't sign anything. Don't agree to anything. I'll handle it." Jack wasn't just bold. He was reckless. His arrogance was his greatest weakness, and I was going to use it against him. But first, I had to stop him from causing more damage. I spent the next few days cleaning up his mess, calling suppliers, clarifying contracts, and making sure my employees knew exactly who was in charge. Jack might have been a smooth talker, but he didn't understand the relationships I'd spent years building. The scariest part of all this wasn't just Jack's actions. It was how complicit Claire had become. Whether she realized it or not, she was enabling him. Diane confirmed that Claire had signed over access to certain joint accounts Jack had started draining. He was careful, never taking too much at once, but the pattern was clear. He was preparing for something big, and Claire was the key to making it happen. When I confronted her about the accounts, she brushed it off like it was nothing. "Jack said it was just temporary," she said, her tone dismissive. "You're always so controlling about money, Andrew. Maybe this is a good thing." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. The woman I'd spent a decade building a life with was defending a man she'd known for less than a year. A man who was systematically dismantling everything we'd worked for. But I kept my anger in check. Losing my temper wouldn't fix anything. If anything, it would push her further into Jack's corner. That night, as Claire slept soundly in the guest room, she hadn't slept in our bed for weeks. I sat at the dining table with Diane's latest report. It detailed every scheme Jack had pulled, every family he'd destroyed, and every dollar he'd stolen. He was a parasite, and Claire was just his latest host. But there was something new in Diane's report that sent a chill down my spine. Jack wasn't just working alone. His accomplices, Mia, the hacker, and Victor, the lawyer, had been quietly laying groundwork for a much larger operation. Diane had intercepted emails suggesting they were targeting another family in town. Linda, the widow who owned a chain of businesses. Jack was using Claire to build credibility, but Linda was the real prize. Jack had already started planting seeds with Linda, attending her charity events and offering advice on how to expand her business. If he succeeded, he wouldn't just ruin my life. He'd ruin hers too. And Linda, unlike me, had no idea what she was walking into. It wasn't just personal anymore. Jack's actions had spiraled into something far more dangerous, something that could hurt not just me but others around me. I couldn't wait any longer. The time for watching and waiting was over. It was time to act. I called Derek and Diane to my house the next morning. As we sat around the dining table, I laid out everything we knew. "Jack isn't just coming after me," I said, my voice steady but full of resolve. "He's coming after everyone he can sink his claws into. If we don't stop him now, he's going to destroy more lives." Diane nodded, her expression grim. "We have enough evidence to expose him," she said. "But if we're going to do this, we need to be smart about it. He's careful, but he's not invincible." Derek leaned forward, his fists clenched. "What's the plan?" I looked at both of them, my anger finally giving way to determination. "We're going to show Jack that he's not as untouchable as he thinks. And we're going to make sure he can't hurt anyone else ever again." The time for sitting back and watching was over. Jack had made his moves, drawn his lines, and tested my limits. Now it was my turn. If he thought he could take my wife, my home, and my life without consequences, he was about to learn just how wrong he was. The first step was to bait him into overextending himself. Jack was arrogant, too arrogant to see when someone was outmaneuvering him. Diane had already uncovered enough dirt on him and his network to blow his entire operation wide open. But if we went public too soon, he'd slip away like the snake he was. No, I needed to draw him out, to make him believe he'd already won. Diane suggested a plan. We need to make him think there's more to take, she said during one of our late-night strategy meetings. If he's convinced there's something bigger within his grasp, he'll get careless. She was right. Jack's ego wouldn't let him pass up an opportunity to further humiliate me. So, we started laying the groundwork for a trap he wouldn't be able to resist. First, I had to act like I was crumbling. I stopped fixing the house, let the lawn grow wild, and started skipping community events. People began to whisper, exactly what I wanted. Derek spread rumors around town that I was in financial trouble, that I'd made some bad investments and was looking to sell my business. Word traveled fast, and before long, I knew it would reach Jack's ears. While Derek stirred the pot, Diane and I worked on creating a fake investor. The investor, a wealthy and well-connected man on paper, was designed to be everything Jack couldn't resist. Rich, influential, and supposedly eager to work with me on a lucrative new project. Diane even created a fake email chain and website for this fictional person, complete with glowing testimonials and a history of successful ventures. Then came the piece de resistance, a staged conversation between me and Derek at the local diner. We made sure Jack's favorite accomplice, Mia, was seated a few tables away. We talked loudly about the investor, dropping enough details to pique her interest. I even threw in a few lines about how I was desperate to get the deal done before my financial situation worsened. It didn't take long for the bait to work. 2 days later, Diane intercepted an email from Jack to Mia. He wanted her to dig into the investor and find out more about the deal. It was almost too easy. The next phase of the plan was to set up the meeting. The fictional investor invited Jack to a private estate on the outskirts of town, an abandoned property owned by one of Diane's contacts. It was remote, secluded, and perfect for what we had planned. Meanwhile, Claire began to notice the shift in my demeanor. I had to act like I was still oblivious to her betrayal, like I was too beaten down to care. She started asking questions, probing for cracks in my facade. "Is everything okay, Andrew?" she asked one night as I was reviewing Diane's latest report. "Just work stress," I said, keeping my voice flat. "Nothing to worry about." Her concern felt hollow, almost rehearsed, but I didn't let it get to me. Claire's choices had brought us to this point, and whatever role she played in Jack's downfall would be her way of facing the consequences. As the meeting day approached, Diane and I tightened every loose end. Derek ensured that Jack's involvement in town was well documented, leaving a trail of witnesses who could vouch for his growing interest in my supposed deal. Susan, Jack's former victim, provided critical insights into how he operated, helping us anticipate his next moves. Every piece of the puzzle was falling into place. The night before the meeting, I stood on my porch, staring at the stars and feeling the weight of everything I'd lost and everything I was about to reclaim. Jack thought he'd broken me, but he didn't understand who he was dealing with. This wasn't just about revenge. It was about justice, about taking back what was mine and ensuring he could never do this to anyone else. The next morning, I watched from a safe distance as Jack's car pulled up to the estate. He stepped out, dressed to impress, with that same smug grin plastered across his face. He thought he was about to score his biggest win yet. He had no idea he was walking straight into a trap. When Jack pulled up to the estate that morning, I was already watching from a distance. I'd parked my truck behind a grove of trees, far enough away to remain unseen, but close enough to witness everything. This was the moment I'd been waiting for. The moment Jack would realize he wasn't as invincible as he thought. He stepped out of his car, dressed like he was ready to close some high-profile deal. His suit was perfectly tailored, his shoes polished to a mirror shine. Jack always had a knack for presentation. It was part of his game, looking like someone who had everything under control, someone you'd want to trust. But I knew better. Beneath the surface, he was nothing but a fraud. The estate, an abandoned property owned by one of Diane's contacts, was the perfect backdrop for this meeting. Its grandeur gave it an air of legitimacy, but the emptiness made it clear that Jack was walking into unfamiliar territory. He looked around, his sharp eyes scanning the driveway and the entrance, But he didn't see anything out of the ordinary. That was exactly how I wanted it. I stayed put as he walked inside, carrying a leather briefcase like some big-shot businessman. He thought he was about to meet a wealthy investor, someone desperate to partner with him on a lucrative deal. In reality, he was about to meet his reckoning. Inside, Diane and Derek were waiting, posing as the investor's associates. Diane had rehearsed her role to perfection, exuding an air of professionalism and authority. Derek, on the other hand, played the part of the silent muscle, leaning against a wall with his arms crossed, his expression unreadable. The stage was set. Jack greeted them with his usual charm, shaking hands and flashing that smug smile. "Thank you for taking the time to meet with me," he said smoothly. "I've been looking forward to this opportunity." Diane didn't miss a beat. "Of course," she replied, gesturing for him to sit. "We've heard a lot about you, Mr. Turner. Your reputation precedes you." As Jack sat down, I finally made my move. I stepped out of my truck and made my way toward the estate's entrance. My heart was pounding, but it wasn't fear. It was adrenaline. This was it. This was my moment to take control. I walked into the room just as Diane was handing Jack a folder filled with fake documents we'd prepared. He glanced up, his smile faltering for the briefest of moments before he recovered. "Andrew," he said, leaning back in his chair. "Didn't expect to see you here." "That makes two of us," I said, keeping my voice calm. I walked over to the table and stood opposite him, my hands resting on the back of a chair. "I thought it was time we had a little chat." Jack chuckled, trying to maintain his composure. "Well, this is unexpected, but I'm sure we can all work together here. No hard feelings, right?" I leaned forward, locking eyes with him. "Oh, there are plenty of hard feelings, Jack. But don't worry. By the time this is over, you'll understand exactly why." For the first time, I saw a flicker of doubt in his eyes. Diane took over, sliding the folder across the table. "Mr. Turner, before we proceed, there are some concerns we need to address. These documents suggest a pattern of behavior that's troubling, to say the least." Jack's smile faded as he opened the folder and scanned its contents. Inside were records of his previous scams, along with photos of him and Claire, evidence of his attempts to interfere with my business, and emails Diane had intercepted between him and his accomplices. It was a damning collection, and he knew it. "I don't know what this is," he said, his tone defensive, "but I don't appreciate being accused of something without evidence." Derek, who had been silent until now, stepped forward. "That is the evidence," he said, his voice low and steady. "And there's a lot more where that came from." Jack stood up, his chair scraping against the floor. "This is ridiculous," he snapped. "You can't prove any of this. It's all circumstantial." I straightened up, my eyes never leaving his. "We don't have to prove anything, Jack. Not here, anyway. But trust me, the authorities will be very interested in what we've uncovered." The color drained from his face as the weight of the situation finally hit him. He looked between me, Diane, and Derek, realizing he was cornered. For the first time, Jack Turner, the man who had walked into my life with nothing but arrogance and entitlement, looked scared. "You've made a lot of enemies, Jack," I said quietly, "and now it's time to pay the price." As if on cue, the sound of approaching sirens filled the air. Diane had tipped off the authorities, providing them with just enough evidence to bring Jack in for questioning. He turned to the door, his eyes wide with panic, but Derek stepped in his path. "Where do you think you're going?" Derek said, his voice cold. "We're not done here." Jack's bravado crumbled. He tried to argue, to threaten, but it was no use. The trap had been set, and he'd walked right into it. As the police arrived and led him away, I felt a strange sense of relief. For the first time in months, I was no longer on the defensive. I'd taken control, and Jack was finally out of my life. But this wasn't just about me. It was about everyone Jack had hurt: Claire, Susan, Linda, and the countless others who had fallen victim to his schemes. This wasn't just my victory, it was theirs too. Watching Jack being escorted away by the police should have felt like the end of a nightmare. And in some ways it was. But if life has taught me anything, it's that there's always a mess to clean up after the storm. Jack's arrest was only the beginning of the fallout. And as I stood there on the porch of that empty estate, I realized there was a long road ahead. The first wave of fallout came almost immediately. News of Jack's arrest spread quickly through our small town. People who had once praised him for his charm and charisma were now whispering about the secrets Diane and I had uncovered. His involvement in fraud, manipulation, and deceit was no longer just my problem. It was public knowledge. And with every new detail that came to light, the community started turning against him. But Jack wasn't the only one who faced consequences. Claire, my wife, or whatever she was now, found herself at the center of the storm. Her name was tied to Jack's schemes, and while she hadn't been directly involved in the illegal aspects of his operation, her association with him left her reputation in tatters. Friends she once trusted began to distance themselves. Invitations to social events dried up. It was as if the entire town had decided to hold her accountable for Jack's actions. Claire came to me a few days after Jack's arrest, her eyes puffy and red from crying. She stood on the porch of the home we'd once shared, looking like a shadow of the woman I'd married. "Andrew," she said softly, her voice breaking, "I don't know what to do." I leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed, and stared at her. For a long moment, I didn't say anything. I wanted her to feel the weight of what she'd done, of the choices that had led us to this point. Finally, I spoke. "You made your bed, Claire," I said, my tone cold. "Now you have to lie in it." She flinched, as if I'd slapped her. "I didn't know it would get this bad," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "I didn't know who he really was." "That's the problem, isn't it?" I shot back. "You didn't care to find out. You didn't care about me, about us, about what we built. You let him into our lives, and now we're both paying the price." She tried to apologize, to explain, but I'd heard enough. Whatever guilt or regret she felt now didn't erase the months of lies, the betrayal, or the damage Jack had done under her watch. I told her she needed to leave, to figure out her life without me. "There's no coming back from this, Claire," I said. "Not for us." She left that day, and I haven't seen her since. Part of me felt relief, but another part felt hollow. Despite everything, she'd been my wife for a decade, and watching her walk away felt like closing the door on a chapter of my life I wasn't ready to let go of. The fallout didn't stop with Claire. Diane and I worked tirelessly to ensure Jack's accomplices were brought to justice. Mia, the hacker, tried to flee town but was apprehended when her involvement in Jack's schemes was uncovered. Victor, the slimy lawyer, had his license revoked and faced criminal charges of his own. One by one, Jack's empire crumbled, leaving nothing but ruins. For me, the fallout was quieter but no less significant. My business, once a source of pride and stability, had taken a hit from Jack's meddling. Suppliers and clients who had heard whispers of trouble were wary, and I had to work hard to rebuild trust. It was exhausting, but it was worth it. Slowly, I began to reclaim what Jack had tried to take. The community, too, began to rally around me. Derek, my loyal neighbor, became an even closer friend, helping me rebuild not just my business but my confidence. Susan, one of Jack's former victims, reached out to thank me for taking him down. "You did what I couldn't," she said, her voice filled with gratitude. "You stopped him." But perhaps the most surprising fallout came from within myself. As the weeks turned into months, I began to reflect on everything that had happened, not just Jack's betrayal, but Claire's and my own role in letting our marriage fall apart. It wasn't easy to confront, but it was necessary. I realized that I'd spent so much time building a life for Claire and me that I'd forgotten to nurture the foundation of our relationship. That didn't excuse her actions, but it helped me understand how we'd ended up here. And as painful as it was to admit, it was a lesson I needed to learn. By the end of it all, I felt like a different man, stronger, wiser, and more determined than ever to protect what mattered most. Jack had tried to destroy me, but he'd only succeeded in showing me how much I was capable of enduring and how much I was capable of rebuilding. When the dust finally settled, I found myself standing in the wreckage of what my life used to be. The home Claire and I had shared was empty now, not just of her presence, but of the memories that had once filled it with warmth. The space didn't feel like mine anymore. It felt like a hollow shell. But if there was one thing I knew how to do, it was rebuild. I'd done it before, with my own hands, and I would do it again. The first step was regaining control of my business. Jack had left a trail of confusion and mistrust among my suppliers and clients, but I was determined to set things right. I made calls, had meetings, and personally reassured everyone that I was back in charge and that whatever damage Jack had caused was being addressed. It was exhausting, but every contract renegotiated and every handshake reaffirmed felt like a small victory. Slowly but surely, the foundation of my business grew stronger. Derek, my neighbor and friend, was a constant source of support during this time. He showed up every weekend, whether I asked him to or not, helping me fix up the house and tend to the overgrown lawn. "Can't have you living in the jungle," he joked one afternoon as he trimmed the hedges. His humor was a welcome distraction, and his loyalty reminded me that I wasn't as alone as I sometimes felt. Diane, too, stayed in my corner. She'd gone above and beyond to help me expose Jack, and even after the dust settled, she checked in regularly. "You're tougher than you think," she told me during one of our conversations. "Not everyone could have handled what you did." Her words stuck with me, a quiet reminder that I'd come out of this stronger than I'd gone in. The community, once divided by Jack's charm and manipulation, began to rally around me. People who had once believed Jack's lies now apologized, offering their support in small but meaningful ways. A local diner owner who'd been one of Claire's acquaintances started leaving me free coffee when I stopped by. A few of my clients referred new business my way, helping me recover faster than I'd expected. Each act of kindness was a reminder that while Jack had tried to isolate me, he hadn't succeeded. But the hardest part of rebuilding wasn't fixing my business or the house. It was rebuilding trust in myself. Jack's intrusion into my life had shaken my confidence, making me question everything. My instincts, my choices, even my ability to see the truth in the people around me. It took time, but I started to realize that the fault didn't lie entirely with me. I'd been manipulated, yes, but I'd also fought back. I'd stood my ground and protected what I could, and that counted for something. As for Claire, I heard through the grapevine that she'd moved to another town, starting fresh where no one knew her connection to Jack. I didn't feel anger anymore when I thought of her, just a lingering sadness for what we'd lost. She'd made her choices, and I'd made mine. Forgiveness wasn't about letting her back into my life. It was about letting go of the bitterness that could have held me back. And so, I let it go. Little by little, I began to rebuild not just the physical parts of my life, but the emotional ones too. I reconnected with old friends, spent more time doing the things I loved, and allowed myself to imagine a future that wasn't overshadowed by betrayal. It wasn't easy, and it wasn't quick, but it was worth it. By the time the first anniversary of Jack's arrest rolled around, I felt like a different man. I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was thriving. The trust I'd lost in myself was returning, piece by piece, and with it came a quiet confidence that no one could take away. I'd been tested, broken, and nearly brought to my knees. But I'd risen again, stronger and more determined than ever. And for the first time in a long time, I felt at peace. Victory doesn't always feel like a celebration. It's not fireworks or parades. Sometimes, it's just the quiet knowledge that you survived, that you didn't let the storm wash you away. That's what this felt like. Sitting on my porch one evening, a beer in hand, watching the sunset and knowing that I had made it through. Jack was gone, Claire was gone, but I was still here. And for the first time in what felt like years, I could breathe again. The community had largely moved on from the drama, though I still caught the occasional sympathetic glance or whispered conversation when I went into town. Most people didn't know the full story, just fragments of what Jack had done and how I'd exposed him. That was fine by me. I didn't need the spotlight. What mattered was that he was gone, his schemes unraveled, and his grip on my life broken. Derek, ever the loyal friend, joined me on the porch that evening. He sat down with his own beer and leaned back, the creak of the wooden chair breaking the silence. "Feels different around here now, doesn't it?" he said, his tone light but reflective. "It does," I replied, taking a sip of my drink. "Quieter, cleaner." He chuckled. "Yeah, but you earned it, Andrew. You fought for this." I nodded but didn't say anything. He wasn't wrong. I had fought, harder than I ever thought I could. But it wasn't just the fight that mattered. It was the lesson I'd learned along the way, that resilience isn't about avoiding pain. It's about facing it, standing your ground, and refusing to let it define you. Claire's absence still lingered, like the faint scent of something you can't quite place. I didn't miss her, not in the way you'd miss a partner or a friend. But I missed what we'd had before everything fell apart, the life we'd built together before Jack came along. Sometimes, I wondered if it was all an illusion, or if there had been something real there once. In the end, it didn't matter. She was gone, and I was learning to let her go. As for Jack, I heard through Diane that he'd been sentenced to several years in prison. His accomplices, Mia and Victor, had faced their own punishments, though not as severe. Knowing he was locked away gave me a sense of closure I hadn't expected. He'd always thought he was untouchable, but he'd finally been forced to face the consequences of his actions. That was justice, and it was enough. But my victory wasn't just about what I'd overcome. It was about what I'd rebuilt. My business was thriving again. My relationships with friends and colleagues stronger than ever. The house, once a place of tension and betrayal, had become a sanctuary. I'd poured myself into restoring it, every nail and plank a reminder that this was mine, something no one could take from me. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Derek raised his bottle in a toast. "To new beginnings," he said, his voice steady. "To new beginnings," I echoed, clinking my bottle against his. It wasn't a grand celebration. There were no speeches, no applause. Just two friends sitting on a porch, sharing a quiet moment of peace. And that was enough. As I sat there, the weight of everything that had happened finally began to lift. I wasn't the same man I'd been before Jack showed up in my life. I was stronger, sharper, more aware of what truly mattered. And I knew that no matter what came next, I was ready. Because here's the thing about victory. It's not about what you've lost. It's about what you've reclaimed, what you've built, and who you've become. And as I finished the last sip of my beer, I realized something simple but profound. This was my place. It always had been. And no one, not Jack, not Claire, not anyone, could ever take that away from me again.